The Arizona desert doesn't weep, but men do. In the jagged shadows of the Dragoon Mountains, a warrior's spirit was breaking, not under the enemy's fire, but beneath the relentless cries of his own starving child. He was Tarza, a name that once meant terror to his foes, now a widower with nothing but a dying legacy in his arms. He had fought soldiers and settlers, but against the primal scream of his infant daughter, he was utterly defeated. Then, through the shimmering heat, a silhouette appeared. She wasn't a warrior or a ghost. She was a woman carrying life in one hand and warmth in the other. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Dragoon Mountains in the fall of 1882. It beat down on the granite outcrops and the thorny scrub, bleaching the very memory of color from the land. For Tarza, a Chiricahua Apache, the heat was not the enemy. It was the silence that followed the heat, a silence that was always inevitably shattered by the wail of his daughter. Her name was Alishani, meaning, "She plays all the time," a name chosen in hope by a mother who now slept forever beneath a cairn of stones. Nalin, his brave wife, had survived the raids, the forced marches, the loss of their ancestral lands. But she had not survived the birth of their child. The world had given Tarza a daughter, and in the same breath stolen his sun and stars. Now Alishani did not play. She cried. It was a thin, piercing sound that scraped Tarza's nerves raw. It was the cry of gnawing hunger, a cry he was powerless to soothe. He had tried everything. He had chewed mesquite beans into a soft pulp, but the baby's small mouth refused it. He had offered water from his canteen, drop by precious drop, which only seemed to anger her more. He held her against his bare chest, the heat of his skin a poor substitute for a mother's warmth and nourishment. He rocked her, pacing the narrow confines of their hidden shelter, a shallow cave tucked into a rock slide. He sang the old songs, the chants of strength and protection his father had taught him, but his voice was a gravelly whisper of grief, and the songs held no magic for this new, desperate pain. Each cry was a betrayal. It was a beacon in the wilderness, a signal to any scalp hunter or cavalry patrol that might be scouring these hills. The price on an Apache warrior's head was high, and men like Jason Kane, a rancher with a known hatred for the red man, paid extra for proof. Tarza knew the risks. Every wail that echoed off the canyon walls was a potential death sentence for them both. He pressed the baby closer, trying to muffle the sound with his own body, a futile gesture that only made her scream louder, her tiny fists beating against his chest. Desperation was a physical thing, a coiling serpent in his gut. He was a warrior. He knew how to track, to fight, to survive on a handful of piñon nuts for a week. He could read the land like a scholar reads a book, but he did not know how to be a father to a motherless infant. Nalin would have known. She would have hummed a gentle tune, her body providing the miraculous sustenance his could not. The thought of her was a fresh agony. He squeezed his eyes shut, seeing her face, her smile, the light in her eyes dimming until it was gone. "Hush, little bird," he murmured, his voice cracking. "Hush now." But Alishani could not be soothed. Her cries intensified, echoing through the twilight air. It was the sound of a life on the brink, a life he had sworn to protect. He looked down at her red, scrunched-up face, her tear-filled eyes, and his warrior's heart, a thing he had thought hardened by battle and loss shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had failed his wife. Now he was failing his daughter. He slumped against the rock wall, the baby still screaming in his arms, a lone man against the vast, indifferent wilderness, utterly and completely broken. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, and in the growing darkness the sound of his daughter's sorrow was the only sound in the world. Then he heard something else. A snap, a twig breaking under a careful foot. Instantly the warrior replaced the father. He went silent, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He shifted Alashane to one arm, his other hand moving with fluid grace to the hilt of the worn cavalry knife at his belt. He was no longer a grieving man. He was a predator, listening, waiting. The baby's cries, which seconds before had been a source of despair, were now a deadly liability. He had to silence her. He opened his mouth to press it over hers, to cut off the sound, a desperate act that might save them, but could also harm her. But before he could, a shadow detached itself from the rocks 50 yards away. It wasn't the hulking form of a soldier or the swaggering gait of a bounty hunter. It was smaller, hesitant, feminine, and it was carrying something. Sarah Jane Miller believed in routine. Routine was what had kept her sane after her husband Thomas was taken by the cholera that swept through Tucson 2 years prior. Routine was what kept her small homestead, nestled in a protective crook of the foothills, from being swallowed by the wilderness. Every morning she milked her goat Daisy. Every afternoon she tended her meager garden. Every evening she bolted the door and cleaned the single-shot Springfield rifle Thomas had left her. Routine was a wall she built around her grief, each task a brick against the loneliness. That evening, the routine was broken by a sound. At first she thought it was a coyote pup separated from its mother. But as she stood on her porch, the scent of wood smoke and dust in the air, she realized the sound was different. It was higher, more desperate. It was human. It was a baby. Fear, cold and immediate, washed over her. A baby meant people. And out here, miles from the nearest town of Tombstone, unexpected people were rarely good news. They were prospectors with gold fever in their eyes, outlaws on the run or worse. Her hand instinctively went to the small pistol tucked into her apron. The crying continued, a persistent, heartbreaking lament that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. It pulled at something deep inside her, a maternal instinct she thought had withered away with her hopes of having a family with Thomas. She found herself standing at the edge of her property, peering towards the sun-scorched hills where the sound originated. Her sensible mind, the one that managed her supplies and kept her rifle clean, screamed at her to go inside, bolt the door and ignore it. It wasn't her business. Survival meant minding your own business. But her heart, the foolish, tender thing that still ached for her husband, argued back. A baby was crying. An infant was in distress. What if its mother was hurt? What if they were from a broken-down wagon, desperate for water? She stood there for a long time, the internal battle raging as the sky bled into twilight. The crying was weaker now, interspersed with ragged gasps. It was the sound of a life fading. Damn it all, she whispered to the empty porch. She made her decision. Fear was a luxury she couldn't always afford. Compassion was a necessity that made her human. She moved with purpose. From the cool larder she fetched a small flask of Daisy's milk, still warm. She grabbed a clean rag. Then she went to the woodpile and gathered a small bundle of seasoned mesquite, tying it with a length of twine. It was a strange offering, perhaps, but it was what she had. Food and warmth, the two most basic needs in this harsh land. Lastly, she picked up the Springfield. It was heavy and familiar in her hands, a grim comfort. She wasn't a fool. She would offer help, but she would be ready for trouble. She moved slowly, her worn leather boots making little sound on the rocky ground. She followed the now intermittent cries, her eyes scanning every shadow, every rock formation. The landscape was treacherous, filled with places for an ambush. She kept the rifle ready, her thumb resting near the hammer. She found them in a hollowed-out crevice beneath a jumble of boulders. The sight made her stop dead, her breath catching in her throat. It was an Apache warrior. He was lean and hard, his skin the color of burnished copper, streaked with dirt and sweat. His black hair was held back by a simple cloth band. He wore buckskin leggings and worn moccasins, but his chest was bare, revealing a map of old scars. In his arms he held the source of the crying, a tiny infant wrapped in a dirty blanket. The man's face, etched with lines of exhaustion and despair, was turned down towards the child. He hadn't seen her yet. Every story she'd ever heard, every warning, whispered in tombstones, screamed at her to run. The Apache Wars were a fresh wound in the territory. Men like this were spoken of as ghosts, as savages. But what she saw was not a monster from a campfire tale. She saw a father in utter agony. He must have sensed her presence. His head snapped up, and his eyes locked onto hers. They were dark, fierce, and filled with a pain so profound it was almost physical. In a single fluid motion, he shifted the baby and drew a long, menacing knife. He was on his feet, a cornered animal ready to fight to the death. Sarah Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. Her fingers tightened on the rifle. They stood frozen for a long moment, a tableau of suspicion and fear. A widowed white woman and a widowed Apache warrior, two worlds colliding in a dusty, forgotten corner of the Arizona territory. The only sound was the baby's whimpering, a fragile thread connecting them across an abyss of hatred and mistrust. The silence stretched thin and taut, ready to snap. Taza stood poised, the knife held low and ready. His eyes narrowed, and sharp, missed nothing, the way the woman held the rifle not aggressively, but defensively. The slight tremble in her hands, the bundle of wood at her feet, the small flask clutched in her other hand. She was afraid, but she wasn't running. Sarah Jane's mind raced. She could raise the rifle, but what would that accomplish? Shoot a man holding a baby, the thought was abhorrent. He was a threat, yes, but he was also a protector. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the Springfield, resting its butt on the ground, but keeping her hand on the barrel. It was a gesture of de-escalation, a risk. The baby, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I heard the crying. Taza said nothing. His expression was a mask of stone, but his eyes were a vortex of conflict. He had expected a soldier, a hunter. He had not expected this. A woman with pale skin and eyes the color of a summer sky carrying firewood. She's hungry, Sarah Jane stated the obvious, her gaze fixed on the tiny whimpering bundle. I have milk. She held up the flask. It was a peace offering, a white flag. Taza's eyes flickered from the flask to her face, searching for a trick, a trap. The white people the Inda had taught him that their kindness was often the sharpest blade. But his daughter Alashani chose that moment to let out a particularly pitiful cry, her small body shuddering with the effort. The sound broke through his warrior's resolve. With agonizing slowness, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah Jane's breath escaped in a silent rush. She took a tentative step forward. He tensed the knife, glinting, and she froze. This was a dance on a razor's edge. She had to show him she meant no harm. Kneeling down, she placed the bundle of firewood on the ground. Then she uncorked the flask. She took another slow step, holding it out. It's goat's milk. It's fresh. He watched her, his gaze unwavering. He made no move to take the flask. He could not. His hands were full with his daughter and his weapon. Understanding dawned on Sarah Jane. She looked at the baby, then at the man's exhausted face. Taking another deep breath, she stepped closer, right into the circle of danger he represented. She could smell the sweat and dust on him, the scent of a man who had been running for a long time. "Let me," she whispered. His entire body went rigid. The thought of handing his daughter the last piece of Nalin in the world to this white woman was unthinkable. And yet, Alashani was fading. He could feel the weakness in her cries, the slight tremor in her limbs. He looked into the woman's eyes. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw something else. Pity. Compassion. It was a look he had not seen from a white person in a very long time. It was the look his own mother had given to a lost foal. His decision was not made with his mind, but with his heart, the broken part that belonged to his daughter. He slowly, reluctantly knelt on one knee, never taking his eyes off her. He eased Alashani into a more stable position in the crook of his arm. Sarah Jane's hands shook as she brought the flask to the baby's mouth. She tore a small piece from the clean rag she'd brought and soaked it in milk, then gently squeezed a few drops onto the baby's lips. At first, Alashani turned her head away, her cries weak. "Come on, little one," Sarah Jane murmured, her voice soft and soothing. "Just a little." She tried again. The scent of the milk seemed to register. The tiny mouth, a perfect rosebud, opened slightly. A small pink tongue emerged and tasted the drop. There was a pause, a moment of fragile suspense, and then the baby began to suckle weakly at the damp cloth. Taza watched, mesmerized. The change was immediate. The desperate crying ceased, replaced by small, eager sounds. Alashani's fists, which had been clenched in misery, uncurled. He could feel the tension leaving her tiny body as the life-giving liquid trickled into her. Relief washed over Taza so powerfully his knees felt weak. He finally lowered the knife, laying it beside him on the ground. The immediate threat to his daughter was no longer this woman. It was the hunger that had been consuming her. Sarah Jane continued to patiently feed the baby drop by drop until the flask was half empty. Alashani's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. A small milk bubble formed on her lips. For the first time in days, she was peaceful. When she was done, Sarah Jane carefully corked the flask and placed it on the ground. She looked at the warrior. His face was no longer a mask of hostility. In its place was a raw, unguarded exhaustion, and a flicker of something that looked like gratitude. "She needs to be kept warm," Sarah Jane said, quietly, nodding towards the wood. Without a word, Taza began to clear a small space in the back of the cave. Using his knife, he struck a piece of flint against the steel blade, sending a shower of sparks into a tinder bundle of dry grass he carried. Within minutes, a small, smokeless fire was crackling its warmth, pushing back the chill of the desert night. They sat in silence for a long time, the firelight dancing on their faces, the sleeping baby a silent testament to their truce. He was an Apache warrior, a man whose people had been hunted and killed by hers. She was a white settler, a woman living on land that had once been his. By all the laws of their world, they should be enemies, but in the quiet of the cave, with the shared goal of protecting the innocent life between them, they were simply two human beings, survivors bound by a common language of loss and a shared moment of grace. The days that followed settled into a new, unspoken routine, far different from the one Sarah Jane had so carefully constructed. Each morning at dawn and again at dusk, she would make the trek to the hidden cave, carrying a flask of fresh milk and sometimes a small parcel of food for the man, a piece of cornbread, some jerky or roasted vegetables from her garden. She would bring her rifle, but she no longer carried it at the ready. His name, she learned, was Taza. He spoke little his English, halting and heavily accented, but his actions spoke volumes. While she fed Alashani, He would sit silent and watchful, sharpening his knife or restitching a moccasin. After the first few visits, he began to leave her small gifts in return, at the edge of her property, a perfectly crafted snare for catching rabbits, a bundle of medicinal herbs she recognized for treating fever, once even a cluster of eagle feathers, a sign of profound respect she didn't fully understand, but felt in her soul. One afternoon, she arrived to find the hinge on her homestead's gate, which had been sagging for weeks, expertly repaired with braided rawhide. Another time, a rattlesnake she hadn't seen, coiled to strike near her woodpile, was gone, its headless body lying a dozen yards away, a silent warning of his protective presence. He and the baby were ghosts. They lived in the hills invisible to the world, their existence known only to her. A fragile trust was being built, woven from shared silence and quiet acts of service. She found herself thinking of them constantly. She would watch the sun set and wonder if Walashani was warm. She would eat her solitary dinner and wonder if Taza had found enough to eat. Her world, once a small, lonely circle, had expanded to include the warrior and his child. But secrets in a place like the Arizona Territory were water in a sieve. Her weekly supply run to Tombstone was an ordeal she had come to dread. The town was a powder keg of gossip and suspicion. This week the air in Miller's Mercantile felt different. The usual friendly greetings were replaced with curt nods. Eyes followed her as she gathered her flour and salt. It was Martha, the mercantile owner's wife, who finally gave voice to the whispers. "Sarah Jane," she said, her voice low, as she bagged the flour people are talking. Sarah Jane's blood ran cold. "Talking about what Jason Kane's men. They were riding near your property. Said they found tracks, moccasin prints, and smaller ones." She looked pointedly at Sarah Jane. "They say you're harboring a stray." Jason Kane? The name tasted like ash. Kane was a powerful rancher who owned the largest spread in the county. He was a ruthless man who had made no secret of his desire to absorb Sarah Jane's small homestead with its valuable spring into his own vast holdings. Thomas had stood up to him, once a heated argument over water rights that had nearly come to blows. Since Thomas's death, Kane had been like a circling vulture patient and predatory. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah Jane said, her voice tight. "Be careful," Sarah Martha warned, her expression a mixture of fear and pity. "Kane's been stirring up trouble about the Apache again. Says they're raiding his livestock. The town is on edge. If they think you're helping one..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The penalty for aiding an Apache was swift and brutal, administered not by the law, but by a rope and a strong tree branch. Sarah Jane paid for her supplies, her hands trembling slightly, and left without another word. The ride home was filled with a new kind of dread. The alliance she had formed with Taza was no longer just a personal risk. It was a public crime in the eyes of her neighbors. The threat materialized 2 days later. She was feeding Daisy when she heard the horses. 3 riders crested the ridge silhouetted against the morning sun. Leading them was Jason Kane. He was a big man with a florid face and pale, cold eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He reined in his horse at her fence line, his men fanning out behind him. "Morning, Mrs. Miller Kane," said his voice, a gravelly boom that held no warmth. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her hand hovering near the pistol in her apron. "Just checking on my neighbors," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Heard some strange rumors. Talk of you having company." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her fence post. "My men cut the sign of a Chiricahua buck, not 2 miles from here. They're like vermin. You find one, there's a whole nest nearby." "I haven't seen anyone," Sarah Jane said, her voice betraying none of the fear clawing at her throat. I keep to myself. Kane's eyes roamed over her property, lingering on the repaired gate. That's so funny. That gate looks freshly mended, and I could have sworn I saw a wisp of smoke up in them hills the other night. You know, Mrs. Miller, this is a dangerous place for a woman alone. A woman needs protection. This land, it needs a man's hand to manage it properly. The threat was clear. It wasn't just about the Apache. It was about her land, her spring. Taza was a convenient excuse, a tool for Kane to use to pry her off her property. I'm managing just fine, she said, lifting her chin. Kane's smile vanished. There's a $300 bounty on any Apache warrior, dead or alive. A man could get rich. A man could also get killed protecting one. You hear what I'm saying? He leaned forward in his saddle. If I find that buck on your land, I'll assume you're in league with him, and the law won't be able to protect you from what happens next. He held her gaze for a long moment, his cold eyes promising a world of pain. Then he wheeled his horse around. Let's ride, boys. We'll smoke him out soon enough. Sarah Jane watched them go, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. The sanctuary she had offered Taza had now become a trap, and the jaws were closing around all of them. The whispers had become a threat, and she knew with sickening certainty that Jason Kane was a man who kept his promises. The weight of Jason Kane's threat settled over Sarah Jane's homestead like a shroud. Every shadow seemed to hold a spy. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. She continued her trips to the cave, but now they were fraught with a new, sharper terror. She took different paths, moving through arroyos and thickets, erasing her tracks as best she could. She tried to explain the danger to Taza. "Men are looking for you," she said one evening, her voice a low, urgent whisper as she rocked a sleeping Alashani. "A bad man. Jason Kane. He wants my land. He will use you as an excuse." Taza listened, his face impassive, but his eyes were dark with understanding. He knew the name. Kane's cruelty was infamous among the scattered Apache bands. He placed a hand on the stock of her Springfield rifle, then pointed to his own chest. "This man. He fights you. I fight him." The simple declaration of loyalty from a man who had every reason to hate her kind moved her to tears. Their fragile alliance had deepened into something more. In their shared isolation, they had become protectors of one another. She was no longer just the woman with milk. He was no longer just the warrior with a child. They were Taza and Sarah, and the small sleeping baby was the center of their universe. But Kane was a patient predator. He didn't strike directly. Instead, he poisoned the well of public opinion. The whispers in Tombstone grew into open accusations. When Sarah Jane rode in for supplies the following week, she was met with a wall of hostility. At the Mercantile, Martha refused to meet her eye, and served her in stony silence. The blacksmith, a man who had shared coffee with her and Thomas many times, turned his back as she passed. Children who used to wave at her now pointed and whispered. She was an outcast, a traitor, an Indian lover. The isolation was a crushing weight, but the true crisis came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, a lone rider approached her homestead. It wasn't Kane. It was Virgil Earp, the deputy U.S. Marshal for the area, a man known for his stern but fair demeanor. His presence on her doorstep sent a jolt of pure panic through her. "Mrs. Miller," he said, tipping his hat. He had a kind, tired face, but his eyes were serious. "I'm not here on official business. This is a courtesy call." She invited him in, her hands clasped tightly to stop their shaking. He accepted a glass of water but refused a seat. I've known you since you and Thomas first settled here." He began, his voice gentle. "I know you're a good woman, and I know Jason Kane is a snake. But he's a powerful snake, and he's been spinning a tale all over town. He's petitioning the territorial court to have your land declared unprotected and a haven for hostiles." Sarah Jane felt the floor drop out from under her. "He can't do that. This was my husband's land. It's mine now." "He can try," Virgil corrected softly. And with the town in a panic about Apache raids that only ever seem to happen near Kane's property. "Mind you, a judge might just listen." Sarah Jane. "If there is any truth to these rumors, if you are helping someone, you need to make him leave, for your own sake, before Kane takes matters into his own hands." Virgil Earp's warning was not a threat. It was a plea. He was offering her a way out, a chance to save herself. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. Virgil's words echoed in her mind. Make him leave. It was the logical thing to do. She could tell Taza he had to take Alashani and go vanish back into the mountains. It would save her home, her reputation, maybe even her life. She would be alone again, but she would be safe. She thought of Taza's quiet strength, of the way his eyes softened when he looked at his daughter. She thought of Alashani's first smile, a gummy, milky grin directed at her just yesterday. They had become her family, the one she thought she had lost forever. Asking them to leave felt like tearing out her own heart. But what was the alternative to lose everything, to be run off her land, or worse, to see Taza and his baby killed by Kane's mob? Her moment of crisis arrived with the smell of smoke. She awoke with a start, coughing. A hellish orange light filled her window. She scrambled outside and gasped in horror. Her barn, the small structure that housed Daisy and her winter hay, was engulfed in flames. Kane was sending his final message. Panic gave way to cold, hard resolve. She grabbed the rifle a bucket and ran toward the blaze. But it was too late. The dry timber was burning too hot too fast. All she could do was get Daisy out her frightened bleats, tearing through the night. As she stood there, helpless, watching the flames devour a piece of her life, with Thomas, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Taza. He must have seen the fire from the hills. He took in the scene, with a glance, his face, a grim mask of fury. He looked at her at the tears of rage and despair streaming down her face. This was her chance, her breaking point. She could scream at him, blame him, tell him to get out, to leave her to the mercy of her own kind. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. She looked from the burning barn to his stoic face, and she knew she couldn't do it. Betraying him would be a deeper wound than any fire Kane could set. They were in this together. He did this, she said, her voice choked with smoke and fury. Kane. Taza simply nodded. He looked at the burning structure, then at her home, then back at her. There was no more running. The fight was coming to them. We stay, he said, his voice low and resolute. We fight. In the fiery glow of her burning barn, Sarah Jane Miller made her final choice. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was a woman defending her family, and she would not be moved. The dawn that followed the fire was grim. The smouldering ruins of the barn stood as a black skeletal monument to Kane's malice. There was no more hiding. Taza did not return to the cave. He brought Alashani swaddled tightly to Sarah Jane's small cabin. The three of them were now under one roof, a single defiant target. They spent the day preparing. It was a grim, silent affair, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah Jane barricaded the windows with furniture, leaving small gaps to shoot through. She gathered every round of ammunition she possessed, laying the brass cartridges out on the kitchen table. Taza moved with a warrior's economy of motion. He showed her how to use the terrain to their advantage, pointing out the natural choke points in the approach to the cabin. He found a place for Alashani, a small root cellar beneath the floorboards, padded with blankets to keep her safe and muffle any cries. "They will come at dusk," Taza said, studying the position of the sun, "when the light is confusing." His quiet certainty was more chilling than any shout. Sarah Jane's hands were slick with sweat as she handled her rifle, but her mind was clear. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. They had burned her barn. They had threatened her family. This was her home. They would not take it. As the sun began to cast long, distorted shadows across the land, they came. Not 3 riders this time, but nearly a dozen. Jason Kane was at their head, his face flush with whiskey and righteous fury. They were not a posse, they were a mob. Sarah Jane Miller, Kane's voice, boomed across the clearing. "You've been given your chance. Send out the heathen and we'll spare you." Sarah Jane peered through a crack in the window boards. She saw their faces. Some were Kane's hired thugs, but others were men from town, their features twisted by fear and suspicion. Kane had turned her neighbors against her. From his position near the door, Taza answered not with words, but with an arrow. It flew with a silent hiss, embedding itself in the fence post inches from Kane's head. The message was unmistakable. The first gunshot shattered the evening quiet. The battle had begun. What followed was a terrifying blur of noise and violence. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. Sarah Jane, her heart pounding in her ears, found a strange calm settling over her. She raised the Springfield took aim as Thomas had taught her, and fired. One of Kane's men cried out and clutched his shoulder, staggering back. Taza was a phantom of vengeance. He moved between the windows, firing his own ancient bow with deadly accuracy. An arrow took one man in the leg, another in the arm, sowing chaos and fear. He was not shooting to kill Sarah Jane, realized, but to disable to maim. He was a warrior, but he was not a butcher. His fight was to protect, not to slaughter. The mob, emboldened by numbers and liquor, charged. The air grew thick with gunpowder smoke. A man managed to reach the porch, his face contorted in a snarl. Before he could kick in the door, Taza was there. The door flew open, and Taza moved like a striking snake. There was a brief, brutal struggle, and the man was thrown back down the steps, his knife now in Taza's hand. Through it all, a single terrifying sound cut through the din. Alashani began to cry from the cellar. The noise of the battle had woken her. Sarah Jane's blood ran cold. The sound would give away her hiding place. "I'll go," she yelled to Taza over the gunfire. She scrambled to the cellar door, her mind screaming. As she lifted it, a bullet ripped through the floorboards where she had been standing seconds before. She dropped into the darkness, her hands finding the crying baby. She held her close, murmuring soothing words, trying to quiet her, her own body shielding the child's. Above her the fight raged. She could hear Taza's war cry, a sound that chilled the blood, followed by screams of pain. She heard Kane's voice, roaring orders, cursing the Apache's skill. Then a new sound, the roar of a fire too close. Kane, in his fury, had resorted to his favorite tactic. He had thrown a torch onto the cabin roof. Smoke began to seep through the floorboards. Sarah Jane started to cough, Alashani wailing in her arms. They were going to be burned alive. Suddenly, the gunfire from outside intensified, but it sounded different. There were new shots from new directions. Peering up through the cellar door, Sarah Jane saw Taza falter, clutching his side, where a dark stain was spreading across his buckskin shirt. He was hit. Just as despair began to consume her, she heard a new voice, shouting clear and authoritative. "In the name of the law, lay down your arms." This is Deputy Marshal Earp Virgil Earp, and 2 other lawmen had arrived, drawn by the sound of a full-scale firefight. Their presence shattered the mob's courage. The townsmen, realizing they were part of an illegal and now murderous assault, began to scatter. Kane, seeing his plan unraveling, tried to make a run for it, but a shot from Virgil's rifle brought his horse down. The battle was over. Sarah Jane emerged from the smoking cabin, Alashani in her arms, blinking in the twilight. The clearing was a scene of chaos, wounded men, groaning, lawmen rounding up Kane's thugs, and the roof of her home beginning to burn in earnest. She saw Taza first. He was leaning against the cabin wall, the cavalry knife still in his hand, his face pale with pain. Their eyes met across the yard. He had held the line. He had protected them. She ran to his side, tearing a strip from her petticoat, to press against his wound, her tears finally falling hot and fast for what they had endured and what they had almost lost. The chaos of the battle receded, replaced by the grim theatre of its aftermath. The air thick with the acrid scents of gunpowder, burnt timber, and sweat was now punctuated by the groans of wounded men and the sharp authoritative commands of Deputy Marshal Virgil Earp. His 2 lawmen, their faces smudged with soot and streaked with grim determination, moved efficiently through the yard, disarming Kane's thugs and binding their wrists. Jason Kane, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, sputtered threats and curses as Virgil hauled him to his feet from beside his downed horse. "You have no right, Earp. I was clearing out a nest of savages. This is my land by right. The whole town saw it." Virgil, a man whose patience had been worn thin by the territory's endless violence, shoved Kane toward one of his deputies. "What the town saw was you leading a drunken mob to burn a widow out of her home. They'll see the rest when you're standing before a circuit judge. The charges are arson, incitement to riot, and attempted murder. You'll be a guest of the territory for a long, long time." Sarah Jane barely heard them. Her world had narrowed to the space of a few feet to the man leaning heavily against the bullet-scarred wall of her cabin. Taza's face was a pale, stoic mask, but a dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across the buckskin at his side. The sight propelled her into motion, shattering the paralysis of shock. She ran to him, her feet stumbling over the debris of the fight. "You're hurt," she breathed the words, painfully inadequate. His eyes found hers, and in their depths she saw not just pain, but a flicker of fierce pride. He hadn't failed. He had protected them. He gave a short, sharp nod, his hand still gripping the hilt of the bloody knife, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. With Virgil's help, they half-carried, half-dragged Taza inside. The cabin was a wreck, its interior smelling of smoke, the floor littered with splinters and shattered glass. They lowered him onto her bed, the simple mattress, a stark white canvas that was soon stained with his blood. While the deputies managed the prisoners outside, Virgil came back in, carrying a bucket of water from the well. He looked at the scene, the wounded Apache warrior, the terrified but resolute woman, and the sleeping baby in a wooden crate near the hearth, miraculously undisturbed by the final moments of the fight. "I need to dress this," Sarah said more to herself than to him. She began tearing strips from a clean linen sheet, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't feel. "Let me help," Virgil offered, but she shook her head. This was her duty, her right. As she worked her hands, trembling at first, then growing steady, Virgil stood by the door, a silent guardian. "I found the hides from those stolen cattle, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice low and heavy with disgust. "Buried behind Kane's own smokehouse. The brands were clear as day. He slaughtered his own stock just to get the town riled up. He's been poisoning them against you for months, whispering that you were unfit, that this land needed a stronger hand." He shook his head slowly. "He never counted on you having an ally like this one." Sarah gently peeled back the torn buckskin. The wound was raw and deep, bleeding sluggishly. Taza flinched a sharp intake of breath, the only sound he made. She dipped a cloth in the water, her touch surprisingly gentle as she began to clean the wound. He watched her, his body rigid with pain, but his eyes held an unwavering trust that made her own throat tighten. In this moment of utter vulnerability, he was placing his life in her hands, a transfer of faith more profound than any words. Using the medicinal herbs Taza himself had brought her weeks ago, a bitter irony, she packed the wound carefully before binding it tightly with the linen strips. He lay back against the pillows, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow but even. He was exhausted, but he would live. The deputies took Kane and his men away, and a profound quiet descended upon the homestead. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with the echoes of violence. In the days that followed, that silence slowly began to change. The town, confronted with the undeniable truth of Kane's treachery, reacted with a deep and collective shame. There were no direct apologies. The pride of these frontier people was too stubborn for that. Instead, apologies came in the form of anonymous gifts left on the porch at dawn, a sack of flour, a basket of late-season vegetables, a newly forged set of hinges for her broken gate from the blacksmith who had previously shunned her. Martha from the mercantile left a parcel containing soft wool yarn and a note that said only, "For the child." Each gift was a small stitch, helping to mend the tear in the fabric of the community. Sarah accepted them with a quiet, conflicted heart. Forgiveness was a complex terrain, and she was not yet ready to navigate it. Her focus was the cabin. Her focus was their healing. Taza's body mended with the slow, steady resilience of a man accustomed to hardship. But it was the healing of their spirits that truly transformed the small home. As he regained his strength, the quiet spaces between them began to fill with words. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, carving a piece of cottonwood into the shape of a hawk for Alishane, and tell her stories of the Chiricahua. He spoke of the sacredness of the mountains that now cast their shadow over her home, of a time when his people moved with the seasons, free and unbound. He spoke of Nalin, not with the raw agony of fresh loss, but with a tender reverence, describing her skill at beadwork, the sound of her laugh that reminded him of water flowing over stones. In return, Sarah read to him. She pulled out a dog-eared copy of poems by Longfellow that Thomas had cherished. At first, Taza listened with a warrior's stillness, but soon he began to ask about the words, their meanings, their rhythms. She would watch the firelight play across his strong features as he sounded out the strange English syllables, his deep voice lending a new and profound gravity to the verses. She spoke of Thomas, of his dream to build a life here, of his gentle nature and his surprising strength. In sharing the ghosts of their past, they found that the ghosts no longer had the power to haunt them. They became cherished memories, the foundations upon which they were building something new. Alishane was the vibrant, living heart of this new world. She was their shared purpose, the undeniable proof of life's persistence. Her world was simple, the comforting scent of Sarah's skin, the secure strength in Taza's arms. She learned to pull herself up on the edge of her crate, her gummy smiles directed at them both without prejudice. For her there was no Apache warrior, no white woman. There was only Papa and Mama, the two pillars of her small universe. One warm evening, weeks after the attack, Taza was finally strong enough to sit on the porch steps, watching the sunset bleed purple and orange across the horizon. The roof of the cabin bore a patch of new, paler wood, a scar that told their story. He was healed. He was strong. The mountains, his ancestral home, were calling. Sarah came out and sat on the step beside him, a familiar fear coiling in her stomach. The unspoken question of his departure hung between them, heavy and fragile. "You are free to go now, Taza," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She had to say it, to give him the choice. "No one will hunt you. You can take Alashani and return to your people." He didn't answer for a long time. He continued to gaze at the mountains, his expression unreadable. He picked up a smooth stone from the ground, turning it over and over in his palm. Finally, he looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers with a new and startling intensity. "My people are scattered like leaves in the wind," he said, his voice low and raspy. "The life I knew is a ghost. Nalin is with the spirits. For many weeks, I was a man walking in a land of memory and sorrow." He paused, and his gaze shifted, moving from the mountains to the scarred but standing cabin to the doorway where Alashani was sleeping peacefully, and finally back to her face. "A home is not the land," he said, a profound certainty in his voice. "It is not a memory. It is the place where your heart is safe. My heart is here." He reached out, not touching her, but his hand hovered in the space between them, a gesture of immense vulnerability and strength. "My home is here now, with my daughter, with you, if you will have us." The tears that came to Sarah Jane's eyes were not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so deep and overwhelming it felt like a homecoming. She looked at this man, her warrior, her protector, her friend. She looked at the child who was now in every way that mattered hers, too. The life she had planned with Thomas was gone, buried with him under the harsh desert sun. But from the ashes of that life and the ashes of his, something new and resilient had grown. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and laid her hand beside his on the wooden step. It was an answer, a promise. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. They were a strange and unlikely family, forged in fire and blessed by circumstance, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, love could not only survive, but build a new sunrise. The story of Taza Sarah Jane and little Alashani isn't just a tale from the Old West. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to cross any divide. In a world that tried to tear them apart with prejudice and violence, they chose compassion. They prove that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people you fight for, the ones you protect when the world closes in. Their story reminds us that beneath the surface of what makes us different, our culture, our past, our language, lies a shared humanity, a common need for love, safety, and a place to call home. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unlikely love moved you, please take a moment to click the like button and share it with someone who appreciates tales of the human spirit. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life, and don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Thank you for listening.